Alright, this is Block 2, Lecture 4, How Colonial Slavery Evolved. This is very important. The late 1600s marked a turning point in American slavery. It marked a turning point from a general paternalistic feeling of master to slave to a relationship that was much more marked by fear. And there was two things that really created that change. When slavery first arrived on these shores, it was marked by, like we said, a paternal attitude that many slave owners looked at their white indentured servants and their black slaves in much the same light. They were people that needed to be taken care of. It was people that without the help of a kindly and benevolent master could not handle freedom. The large plantations that would come to be the South were not quite so big as they would become in time. Many masters worked hand in hand with their slaves on the plantations. Many families were usually kept together, that slaves were taken care of in their old age. Not to put too racist a sheen on it, but slaves were seen kind of as a loyal pet. And they were to be treated well, and the sense of responsibility that kind of permeated many slave owners marked a paternal, the word's obviously Latin from father, a fatherly sense of, I will take care of my children, and they are better off for me. Of course, these children are grown adults, but that was kind of the attitude. That changed with two things that kind of went hand in hand. First is the Stono Rebellion. That you can take a look at your notes. There was a rebellion of some slaves. They tried to kill their masters, make their way towards freedom, and the militia of the colony got called out. The militia there was a battle. The militia crushed this slave rebellion. So there was in the back of the minds of many white Southerners at the time this idea that, hey, these slaves, we thought that they were, okay being slaves. We thought that, we treated them so nicely that, they didn't have the wherewithal, the means, the desire to rebel. And now all of a sudden they did. And if a slave could rebel, in the Stono area of the Carolinas, then slaves could rebel anywhere. That kind of was the short-term fuse, the trigger, if you will, that set the change in how slavery kind of operated on. The other was the fact that so many slaves had been imported, especially through South Carolina and Georgia, that black Africans made up well over half of a county's population. And in a world where numbers meant a lot in battle, if the slaves were to get guns, then 5 slaves could defeat militarily 2 slave owners. So those two things kind of changed the excuse me. Those two things changed. I'm sorry. I've had a cold since the end of camp. It's terrible. You can comment and make fun of me on the excuse me. All you people are like, that is so disgusting, so don't even do this again. So the fact that in large parts of the South slaves were a majority of the population meant that the slaves had to be much more strictly controlled. And the paternal attitude was replaced by an attitude of fear and an attitude of you always assumed that the slaves were one step away from revolting and murdering you. The long-term kind of reasons for this change was the growth in the slave population. And after Stono, you saw the results of that the importation of slaves was slowed down, and it was much more difficult to free slaves. Slaves got much less freedom of movement than they had before Stono. So these two things really fundamentally changed slavery. And through the early 1700s and mid-1700s, right before the Revolutionary War, slavery in the South was marked by not a paternal attitude any longer in large degree, but by an attitude of fear. An attitude that the slaves were only one step away from rebellion and murder. and that if you were going to prevent that from happening, if a minority population, the whites are a minority in large swaths of South Carolina and Georgia, if you were going to prevent that majority from rising up and overthrowing you and murdering you in your bed and carrying off and sleeping with your wife and raping your children, because that's what they thought. You know, that without being checked, that's what the slaves would do. And fear for your wives and children, there's no greater motivator for that. There's no greater way to be irrational than if you're fearing for the lives of those close to you. So the harsh restrictions were put on slaves after that Stono Rebellion, which was the short-term cause. You know, that slavery had grown so much in the Carolinas that the slave owners looked up and realized that the slaves were not, you know, appreciating being slaves, and there were so many of them that they had to be much, much more tightly controlled.